Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I pray you all are doing well. I had a good prayer. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought us to verse 234 and 235 of Surah al-Baq. And these verses are important because they're in a series of verses about separation, when a husband and a wife separate. And in particular, we will discuss today the issue of widows. So one of the things that's important in our religion and our deen is that Islam speaks about different types of people. In the Quran, you have discussions of wives, of husbands, of sisters and brothers. And inshallah, in these verses today, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes a special emphasis on widows and how they should be dealt with in Islam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins by saying, وَالَّذِينَ يُتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِمْ أَرْبَةَ أَشْهُرٍ وَعَشَرًا. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is speaking about those people, يَتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that there are a certain group of people that their spouses have died, that they're women, but for whatever reason, their husband has passed away. And we know in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that the men would go out and fight and they would die. Many women, of course, they outlive their husbands. So the question of widows is an essential one and part of any community. So there is an issue now of these women and their husbands has passed away. What is their status? Can they get remarried or not? So in Jahiliyyah, there was a custom, as we discussed before, that there was dihar. So someone would say to their wife, "You're like my mother." So they would be on the street, considered divorce. There is something called ila, that I'm not going to come close to you for months or sometimes even years. So the woman is wondering, am I married or am I not? So here, in the Jahiliyyah time, there was a custom that when a man passed away, that her wife would have to be in a state of mourning for months and sometimes even years. So one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Qadat Zainab bint Salama, or this is one of the Sahabihat, كانت المرأة إذا توفي عنها زوجها. So if her husband passed away, and there was a woman in the Jahiliyyah time, دخلت حفشا. And this is an interesting word. This was a small house that they would, in the small area, in the Bedouin, the cities and the villages, she would enter the small house away from the people. وَلَبَزَتْ شَرْ ثِيَابِهَا. And she would wear the worst clothes, black and ripped. وَلَمْ تَمَسَّ طِيبًا. She would not wear any scent, anything good. وَلَا شَيْئًا حَتَّى تَمُرَّ بِهَا سَنَةً. So one whole year, she would be in a state of mourning, and she would be isolated from the rest of the community. ثُمَّ تَخَرَّجْ. So then after that, ثُمَّ تَخْرُجْ. She would come out, and she would be mixed with the people. So just like in Dihar and Ilah and all these different customs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala minimized this and said, no, this is not permissible. That many of us also coming from different cultures of the world, that the widow is supposed to be in a state of sadness, and as Islam we agree on that, but perpetual sadness, meaning she has to always be sad. She always has to think about her husband. She can never remarry. Some, even in our South Asian cultures, the woman would go into the grave with her husband, right? Because she's not supposed to be an independent person. Rather, she's always attached to her spouse. And we see similar in the Jahiliyyah times, that the woman had to be in the state of mourning and yelling and screaming for months. But as we see here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala limits this mourning period to how long? 4 months and 10 days. Now, one of the questions here that the ulama they discuss in detail is that what does this mourning period mean? So does it in terms of clothing and dress, in terms of speaking? So the major thing is that in this period, the woman does not get married. And she shouldn't necessarily try to pursue marriage at this time, nor should people come to her with proposals of marriage, as we'll see in a little bit. Rather, this is a state of mourning time. Her husband just passed away, and it's an opportunity to reflect and to grow. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِذَا بَلَغْنَا أَجَلَهُنَّ فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي مَا فَعَلْنَا فِي أَنفُسِهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. So after that time period, then you are allowed to approach that person, and that woman is allowed to get remarried. And once again, this is very important in Islam, that in our Muslim cultures that many of us are part of, we look down at the women who remarry, whether it's after divorce or whether after their husband passed away. But in Islam, in the Quran, it allows the woman to do that. The only restriction is that there is a limited mourning period that she goes through. But this is an option. Does every widow have to get remarried? No, she may not want to get married. But if she wants that emotional, physical, spiritual intimacy and companionship, then that is something of her right. Wallahu bima ta'maluna khabir. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, is khabir, all-knowing of what is in our hearts. And then we see in the next verse, in the final verse for today, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِيمَا أَرَّدْتُمْ بِهِ مِنْ خِطْبَةِ النِّسَاءِ أَوْ أَكْنَنْتُمْ فِي أَنفُسِكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says there is no harm in this period if someone indirectly would say that they admire this woman. So it's haram to go directly and propose to a woman who just lost her husband. This is not appropriate, and this is not appropriate culturally and socially. That a family, they're mourning, and then someone comes and proposes to the person who just lost their spouse. But here, the ulama, they say, and the mufassirin, that if it's done indirectly, that someone, for example, says, وَفِي رِوَايَةٍ, someone says, وَدَدْتُ أَنَّ اللَّهَ رَزَقَنِي إِمْرَأَةً. So if someone says, and they say, Ya Allah, I pray that someone gives me a righteous spouse. Right? And then another example, وَدَدْتُ أَنِّي وَجَدْتُ إِمْرَأَةً صَالِحَةً. I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives me a good and pious wife. So if someone says this indirectly, then there is no harm. This is not a direct proposal. Or if someone decides that they're going to keep it to themselves, that they're not going to share their feelings or thoughts, then this is also part of the sunnah and part of the Quranic message. However, what is not permissible, عَلِمَ اللَّهُ أَنَّكُمْ سَتَذْكُرُونَ هُنَّ وَلَكِنْ لَا تُوَعِدُهُنَّ سِرًّا. That you shouldn't go to this person that just lost their spouse and start speaking to them secretly, encouraging them to do zina. إِلَّا أَن تَقُولُوا قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Except that you say something that's right and true and just, and see how you can support that person and their family. وَلَا تَعْزِمُوا عُقْدَةَ النِّكَاحِ حَتَّى يَبْلُغَ الْكِتَابُ أَجَلَهُ. So don't approach and speak directly about marriage, except when this mourning period is done. And here the ulama, they focus on the word al-kitab. What does this mean? Meaning this ruling. كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ. So kitab and kataba is used to talk about the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَعْلَمُ مَا فِي أَنفُسِكُمْ فَاحْذَرُوا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then here, and this is one of the beautiful things of learning the ahkam from the Quran. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have said, okay, the mourning period is 4 months and 10 days. But here the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a spiritual lesson. And says that, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in ourselves. He knows what we're thinking, what we're desiring, our hopes. And this is important, that in our marital relationships, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even knows who likes who or who has interest in the other person. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows all of this. But the question is, what are we doing? How are we implementing this? And how are we living with taqwa? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاحْذُرُوا. Be cautious, be aware, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what may be in our hearts, who we desire, who we intend. وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. And know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ghafoor and Halim, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forgiving and forbearing. That in this process of separation, of divorce, of remarriage, there may be mistakes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala understands these mistakes and is forgiving and is patient with all of us. So to conclude, brothers and sisters in Islam, well, we see that Islam is a deen of wasatiyah. It's a balanced religion. That in some religions, when someone passes away, you're supposed to be tough and strong and not cry and say, oh, they're going to Jannah. But we know that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he cried when Ibrahim alayhi salam. And people, when Ibrahim, his son, passed away, and they asked him, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, are you crying? Don't you? He's a kid, you know he'll go to Jannah. He said, we're human. So all of us will feel this. All of us have experienced loss. and someone close to us passing away. And there is this natural mourning period that we have to affirm. That we as Muslims are not tough and say, no, this didn't affect me. Of course, that loss is sad, even though we believe, inshallah, and we pray that they'll go to Jannah. At the same time, we don't believe in the extreme. Yes, we mourn, but we don't believe in perpetual mournness. That you always have to be sad. You always have to be depressed now because your husband or your wife or a child or someone close to you passed away. Yes, there's that moment. You have to feel the pain, the sadness. You have to go to the janazah. You have to pray for them, maybe do a memorial service, give sadaqah jariyah in their name, pray for them in your salawat. If your parents especially have passed away, please pray for them in every single prayer. But we believe in a limited time, that there's a certain time you have to move on with your life. And here we see that a man and a woman, that they can remarry if they choose so. Also we see it's remarkable the idea of communication. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about how you should communicate to a woman in this period. And this is very important in our marriages and something that Imam Majid and Sheikh al-Daraf and others have mentioned, that we are taught that in the premarital counseling and in the counseling, how to communicate with one another. And this is important because sometimes people are very direct in marriage or in expressing their thoughts and interests, and sometimes they're subtle. And they don't know when I should be direct and when should I be subtle. It's because sometimes they are confused on this. And sometimes they're very direct, and then it's a turn-off to the other person. Sometimes they're subtle, and people don't understand. So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this, how do you communicate in this period? That it's inappropriate to be very direct when a woman has passed away. But later on, as people and families have been able to mourn, then life can go on. And lastly, we have to pause and reflect on how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the widows in the Quran. And if we reflect right now, that there's probably a widow within each of our families and our extended networks. You probably know someone who lost their husband. And we have to ask ourselves, how can we support them? And the first thing is to obviously meet with them and talk to them and say, what support do you need? Some may want to get remarried and have a new spouse and find that emotional and spiritual companionship. Others, no, they don't need that. They don't want to get remarried. Rather, they need finances. They lost their husband who was supporting them and was a breadwinner and worked hard, and now they have no one to pay for the kids and the household. Others, they feel that loneliness, that now they don't have someone at home. They have someone to talk to, someone that they could potentially work for and support and cook, and they just want someone to call them or visit them and ask them how they're doing. And this is part of our sunnah, is that we think about the different aspects of our community that need support, whether it's the fuqara, whether it's the yatim, the widows, the aramid. We should have to think, how can we support these people? And I make it a homework to myself and to, inshallah, all of us, that we reflect on this verse and reflect on how we can support the widows within our community. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.